Among the 6 wives of Henry VIII, only one was rejected on her very wedding night, and ironically, she turned out to be the happiest survivor of them all. The cruel comedy began right after the wedding on the night history remembers as the consummation. For Henry and Anne, it was the beginning of embarrassment. Henry entered the chamber, lay beside his new bride, and nothing happened. The next morning, instead of praising her beauty or sweetness, Henry openly confessed to his courtiers that he could not do the duty of a husband. He complained that Anne smelled that her body was unattractive, her breasts sagging, and that he could not summon the slightest desire. Why would a king infamous for his lust, one who did not hesitate to kill his wives for both passion and politics, end up with a reject queen, a consort he publicly mocked, discarded, and turned into the butt of courtly gossip? And stranger still, how did this woman not only survive, but become one of the rare figures who could look back at the bloody shadows of the Tudor dynasty with a smile? Her name was Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's 4th wife. She held the title of queen for barely 6 months, so brief, it seemed like a gust of wind in the heavy air of the English court. Yet in that short span lay a remarkable truth. Anne, the woman Henry spurned, managed to escape the deadly machinery that crushed so many women before and after her. This is not merely the tale of a failed marriage. It is where politics collided with sex, where painted portraits clashed with raw reality, where the power of a notorious king bore down on the fragile survival of a woman turned into a pawn. Anne of Cleves was neither the tragic lover like Anne Boleyn, nor the youthful victim like Catherine Howard. She entered history in a strange role, a queen humiliated, cast aside, yet ultimately the silent victor in a deadly game of power. So, what lies behind the title of the reject queen? Was she truly a victim of a misleading portrait, or a shrewd survivor who seized her one chance at life, in a court where beauty was so often a double-edged sword? The story of Anne of Cleves offers us a paradoxical truth. Sometimes humiliation is the path to freedom. And sometimes to survive history, you don't need love, you just need to be rejected at the right time. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and step with us into the world of those who changed history and the secrets that textbooks never told. Some paintings in history are more than works of art. They are the spark that ignites political tragedies, deaths, and even cursed marriages. For Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, everything began with a portrait. It wasn't the kind of painting meant to hang in a museum to showcase eternal beauty, but rather a contract in color. A promise sealed in oil paint leading to one of the bitterest mistakes in the life of England's most notorious king. The stage was the late 1532nd. Henry had already survived 3 tumultuous marriages. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had broken with the Pope, had lost her head. Jane Seymour, who gave him his long-awaited son Edward, had died in childbirth. Henry was caught between personal grief and a looming political nightmare. England was isolated. Alliances with France and Spain were faltering. Rome branded him a heretic, and he needed a new marriage to stabilize his fragile throne in the eyes of Europe. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's right hand, the architect of England's Reformation. He proposed a plan: marry a German princess, in particular one from Cleves, a small duchy with powerful Protestant connections. The choice was strategic: Anne of Cleves. She wasn't from an imperial powerhouse, but her family ties promised alliances in the heart of Reformation Europe. Cromwell believed this match would secure his own precarious place at court. But in the 16th century, politics and desire were inseparable. Henry didn't only need a wife to bolster his throne, he needed a woman who suited his taste. The problem: he had never met Anne, and he couldn't exactly slip across to Germany for a casual introduction. In an age without photography, the fate of kingdoms rested in the hands of an artist, a brush, and a discerning eye. That artist was Hans Holbein the Younger. A German genius working at the Tudor court, Holbein was famed for portraits so vivid people claimed he could capture not just the face, but the very soul of his subjects. He was dispatched to Cleves to paint the 2 sisters Anne and Amalia so Henry could choose. Picture the scene: a drafty chamber in Cleves Castle, pale winter light filtering through the windows, and Holbein knowing that every stroke of his brush could decide the destiny of a dynasty. He painted Anne with clear eyes, fair skin, a rounded face, and hands folded demurely. The portrait survives today, and looking at it, it's hard to call her ugly. By modern standards, she radiates a calm, modest beauty, no vanity, but a quiet dignity. The painting was sent to London. Henry saw it, and he was pleased. To him, it wasn't just a likeness, it was a promise framed in color. This was the woman who would play her part, secure alliances, and soothe his heart after loss. But that portrait, whether faithful or not, became a trap. Historians still debate, did Holbein flatter Anne, or did Henry simply project his fantasies onto the canvas? Some argue Holbein painted honestly within the limitations of the time. Others insist he must have softened the features, knowing Cromwell's wrath, if Anne's prospects were ruined. Perhaps Holbein painted not lies, but the most advantageous version of Anne, neither deceitful nor brutally plain. The real problem was Henry himself. He didn't want a portrait, he wanted a dream. He was used to theatrics in love, from the seductive fire of Anne Boleyn to the gentle devotion of Jane Seymour. When he looked at the painting, he didn't see a German princess. He saw an ideal wife conjured by his imagination. And when fantasy collided with reality, the illusion crumbled. Their first meeting was a disaster. Following the romantic customs of the time, Henry disguised himself as a commoner and slipped in to surprise his bride. He imagined a scene of sweetness, the bride recognizing her king hearts, racing eyes, meeting with passion. Instead, Anne, who had never seen Henry outside a portrait, was confused and unimpressed. When a strange man burst in and embraced her, she coolly pushed him away, bewildered, even indifferent. In that moment, Henry felt humiliated. The woman had not recognized him, had not swooned, had shown none of the charm he craved. Fuming, Henry uttered the words that sealed her fate. "I like her not." Those 4 words echoed through the court, branding Anne forever with the shadow of royal disappointment. But was Anne truly as unattractive as Henry claimed? Or was she simply not to the taste of a man accustomed to the refined beauty of English ladies? Records describe her as tall, fair-skinned, and gentle, in manner not the horror Henry painted her to be. In fact, many courtiers found her pleasant enough. What Henry called ugly may have been nothing more than his bruised pride. Holbein's portrait thus became the emblem of the tragedy. It symbolized the gulf between image and reality, between art and life, between expectation and disillusion. A single canvas, a wooden panel brushed with pigment, had dragged an unsuspecting German princess into the eye of the Tudor storm and made her the infamous reject queen. Yet here lies the irony. That very rejection, born of disappointment, saved Anne. Had Henry fallen for her, as he had for Anne Boleyn, she might have lost her head. Had she been his beloved like Jane Seymour, she might have died young in childbirth. Instead, she became something rare, a woman who survived Henry VIII. The portrait that doomed her marriage ultimately secured her life. When we look at that painting today, it is not merely a relic of Renaissance art. It is a hidden verdict, the ticket that brought Anne into Tudor history, and the passport that spared her from the bloody fate of Henry's other wives. And perhaps in the layers of Holbein's brushwork, we can still hear history's quiet sigh. Sometimes a portrait can save more lives than a sword. If Holbein's portrait was the curtain rising on a grand performance, then the marriage of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves turned out to be a clumsy, ill-rehearsed play with a reluctant lead actor and an audience waiting for the comedy to unfold. From the moment Henry muttered asterisk, "I like her, not asterisk," the fate of the union was sealed. Yet, in the Tudor court, words could not so easily be turned into actions. Politics, diplomacy, and the dignity of a king forced Henry into a marriage his heart had already abandoned. On the 6th of January 1540, the ceremony took place at Greenwich Palace. Henry entered the wedding not with the glow of a man in love, but with a heavy, sour expression. It is said he even tried to persuade his courtiers to find a last-minute way to stop it, but all such efforts came to nothing. The alliance with Cleves was carefully arranged. The German court had sent their princess, and Cromwell had staked his entire political standing on this match. Even Henry, as powerful as he was, could not humiliate all of Europe by rejecting his bride at the altar. Anne, weighed down by her elaborate gown, could hardly have imagined she was stepping into a marriage her husband had already rejected in his heart. She spoke no English. She did not grasp the customs of the Tudor court, and she certainly did not know that behind the blessings and courtly smiles, whispers were spreading about Henry's disgust. At that moment, Anne was not a bride, so much as a pawn on a very large political chessboard. The true farce began after the wedding. The night history calls the consummation the moment when two people were supposed to seal their union. For Henry and Anne, it was the beginning of humiliation. Henry lay beside his wife, and nothing happened. The next morning, instead of praising her beauty or sweetness, he openly confessed to his courtiers that he could not perform the duty of a husband. He complained that Anne smelled that her body was unattractive, her breasts sagging, and that he found no pleasure in her. From then on, the bedroom became politics. Henry turned his private disappointment into a weapon, declaring to his council that he could not consummate the marriage. In the ever-watchful Tudor court, gossip spread fast. Soon all of Europe laughed this king, notorious for his passion, and his countless mistresses now claimed he could not lie with his wife. It was a public humiliation not only for Anne, but for Cleves as well. What is curious is that Anne never resisted. She neither reproached Henry nor tried to defend herself. Perhaps she lacked the voice, or perhaps she understood that she had entered a dangerous game in which silence was the only path to survival. She endured Henry's complaints, the court's gossip, and carried herself with a calm that puzzled everyone. Henry, meanwhile, grew more flustered. He compared Anne with his former wives. Anne Boleyn had been witty, clever, and playful. Jane Seymour was gentle and submissive, softening his temper. But Anne of Cleves, to him she was a Flanders, mere cold, unfeeling, without charm. The phrase stuck, though. In truth, there was no real evidence she was ugly. More likely, it was the bitter insult of a wounded man repeated by history until it hardened into fact. And so the marriage dragged on like a hollow performance that lasted 6 months. Henry made no effort to hide his distaste, yet he did not immediately dissolve the union. He and Anne appeared together in public, kept up the royal rituals, but everyone knew this was an empty bond. Here was a king with absolute power, trapped by politics, forced to share his life with a woman he did not want. The charade continued until Henry found his moment. When the threats from France and Spain eased and the alliance with Germany seemed less necessary, he moved swiftly. He began the process of annulment, citing the lack of consummation. It was a legal fiction, a theatrical excuse, but it allowed Henry to free himself without bloodshed. And when Henry declared that the marriage had never been consummated, it was not only an insult to Anne, but a direct blow to Cromwell. For in the Tudor court, a failed marriage was never fate's fault, but the fault of the man who arranged it. Cromwell, once the most powerful figure at Henry's side, suddenly became the scapegoat. It's worth picturing more clearly who Cromwell really was. He was no nobleman born into velvet and privilege, but a man of humble origins, a drifter who wandered across Europe, fought as a mercenary, lived in obscurity, and through sheer political cunning climbed higher than anyone expected. To the old aristocracy, he was an interloper, a commoner who dared to wield power above ancient houses. The only thing that kept him steady was Henry's trust. But when the marriage to Anne turned into a farce, that trust shattered. Henry, a man never fond of accepting blame, was quick to heap every mistake onto Cromwell. The architect of the Reformation became the man who had trapped the king in a humiliating marriage. Enemies in the court seized their chance. The Catholic nobles who had despised Cromwell for years, those who longed to drag England back into Rome's embrace, whispered into Henry's ear. Cromwell was a traitor, a schemer, the very man who had shamed the king before Europe. Meanwhile, Henry found a new light. Catherine Howard, a young woman of the powerful Howard family, charming, beautiful, and adept at flattering the king. To Henry, she was a cure for disappointment. To Cromwell's enemies, she was the perfect weapon. All they needed was to convince the king that Cromwell stood in the way of this new romance, and the matter would be settled. And it was. In July 1540, less than 6 months after the strange marriage to Anne, Cromwell was arrested. The charges were endless: treason, corruption, conspiracy. But all of it was a mask. In Henry's eyes, Cromwell's true crime was a simple one. He had given the king a wife he did not want. On the very day Cromwell was executed, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard. A wedding followed directly upon a death. Tudor history was often that merciless. A failed marriage did not just break a woman's heart, it could strike the head from the shoulders of a man who had once ruled the realm. Yet beyond Cromwell's fall, this failure carried a larger meaning. It marked the end of a period of sweeping reform in England. A time when Cromwell had pushed Henry to break fully from Rome, seize the wealth of the monasteries, and restructure power itself. With Cromwell gone, England veered onto another path. Politics gave way to Henry's fleshly appetites, to a cycle of short, bloody marriages. A single misstep in matrimony had altered the political rhythm of an entire kingdom. And Anne of Cleves, she lived on as a witness to the bloodletting. Strangely enough, the failure of her marriage saved her. Had Henry adored her, as he once adored Anne Boleyn, she might have lost her head once he tired of her. Had she pursued political ambitions, she might have been crushed in the Tudor machine. But by staying silent, by accepting her role as the king's sister, Anne stepped out of the storm's center, while Cromwell disappeared beneath the blade. This is the sharp paradox of history. The man who seemed the victor, Cromwell holding all the reins of power, became its greatest casualty. The woman who seemed humiliated, Anne rejected by her husband, mocked in public, emerged as the safest survivor. So when we call this marriage a failure, we should remember it was not just the failure of love, but of politics. It revealed how fragile the Tudor throne truly was, that a portrait a kiss withheld could shake the entire court. It revealed that not all deaths in history come from the battlefield. Sometimes they are born in the royal bedchamber. And above all, it revealed the true nature of Henry VIII, a king who never accepted responsibility, always ready to sacrifice others to mask his own weakness and desire. Cromwell did not die for his sins, but because Henry needed a scapegoat to wash away his shame. Anne was not rejected for being too plain, but because Henry needed an excuse to hide the impotence of his heart. This failed marriage, then, is more than a private story. It is a mirror reflecting the raw truth of Tudor politics, that love, beauty, and desire could all be turned into weapons, and the price was always paid in blood. It's almost unbelievable, but while most of Henry VIII's wives walked into marriage with pride only to end up in blood and tragedy, Anne of Cleves followed a completely different path. Her story began with humiliation and embarrassment, yet it ended with a life that many Tudor women would have envied. When her marriage to Henry was annulled after just 6 months, most assumed Anne's fate was sealed, that she would join the long list of victims destroyed by the king's whims and cruelty. But Henry did something no one expected. Instead of executing, banishing, or imprisoning her, he gave her a unique title, asterisk, the king's sister asterisk, along with immense wealth, lavish estates, and the promise of security. In the Tudor court, status was everything. Being the king's wife could be deadly, for each day might end at the edge of an executioner's blade. But being the king's sister was something else entirely, a different kind of power, not political but untouchable. No one could lay a finger on Anne because Henry had placed her beyond the reach of courtly rivalries. In fact, Henry remained on surprisingly good terms with her after their divorce. Anne was granted Richmond Palace Hevercastle, the former home of the Boleyn family kin to Henry's executed second wife, Anne Boleyn, along with numerous properties and a steady income. These transformed her from a reject queen into one of the wealthiest and safest women in England. It is said that during court festivities, Anne was invited to sit alongside the princesses, welcomed warmly by the king himself in front of his courtiers. In a court where women were so often discarded, the sight of a rejected wife still honored in such a way was astonishing. She even grew close to Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom would one day wear the crown. There's a strange irony here. Henry's initial distaste for Anne may have been the very thing that saved her life. Had he truly desired her, she might have been dragged into the same deadly cycle that consumed his other wives, where passion turned into hatred and hatred into death. Rejection made her the exception, the one woman who was neither wife nor threat, yet treated like family. Still, Anne's later life wasn't entirely a bed of roses. She had to adjust to a foreign land where her English was clumsy and her family absent. Her wealth and safety carried with them a bitter truth: she only possessed them because a man had dismissed her as undesirable. Deep down, Anne must have known she had been turned into an odd footnote in Tudor marital history, a reject queen who survived because of the king's disappointment. Yet in an age when so few women could shape their own destiny, Anne managed to carve out a life of peace, comfort, and above all, longevity. She outlived every other wife of Henry VIII. When she died in 1557 at the age of 41, she was buried in Westminster Abbey, an honor not granted to every queen. Anne's death was unlike that of Henry's other wives. No tragedy, no blood, no accusations. She slipped quietly into history, remembered as the woman who was rejected, but who in the end triumphed while all the others had fallen. In the dark and blood-soaked tide of the Tudor dynasty, the wives of Henry VIII are often remembered through a chilling rhyme: asterisk, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Asterisk. It is a neat way for posterity to reduce 6 women queens of England in their own right into a sequence of fates. Yet hidden among the executions, the heartbreaks, and the tragedies, one woman slipped out of the story in a most peculiar way: Anne of Cleves, whom history would brand with the cruel nickname asterisk, the reject queen. Asterisk. And here lies the strangest part. While most of Henry's wives met their ends in sorrow or in blood, Anne lived on until 1557 unthreatened, unimprisoned, and surprisingly respected by the very Tudor court that once dismissed her on their wedding night. Her failure in marriage became the triumph of her life, a paradox history rarely offers. Anne never saw the inside of the Tower as a prisoner, never stood before an executioner's block, never endured the humiliation of public disgrace. Instead, once her marriage to Henry was annulled, she was given the title asterisk. The king's sister asterisk granted a generous annual income and rewarded with vast estates. She moved into comfortable residences from Hever Castle, once the home of Anne Boleyn, to the lavish Richmond Palace. She was no longer queen, but neither was she in danger. And in that paradox, she became the exception, the only woman to step away from Henry's destructive orbit with both her dignity and her life intact. Looking at Anne's legacy, we find more than just a failed marriage. We find a vivid reminder of the fragility of women in Tudor politics. If Henry rejected her, then England had to accept that rejection for beauty in the Tudor court was never a private matter. It was the currency of diplomacy and power. Yet that rejection, ironically, liberated Anne. No longer a pawn in the great European chessboard, no longer trapped in the deadly factional games of the English court, Anne was spared the fate that claimed so many others. The very moment she was rejected was the moment she was set free, and posterity began to see her differently. Catherine of Aragon became the symbol of loyalty and steadfastness. Anne Boleyn, the embodiment of ambition and dangerous allure. Jane Seymour, the ideal wife who died too soon. Catherine Howard, the tragedy of youth and desire. Catherine Parr, the survivor with wit and wisdom. But Anne of Cleves stood apart. She was none of these things. She was not mythologized as lover or victim, not remembered as tragic or great. She was simply the woman who survived without needing to fight. For centuries, Anne was described harshly as the ugly bride whom Henry despised. Yet the more we look, the clearer it becomes that this was a distortion, a product of a male-dominated historical lens. Henry himself, a bloated, paranoid man in his 40s, presumed the right to pass judgment on a young woman he had never met before their wedding day. The infamous image of ugly Anne was less truth than propaganda, a narrative designed to soothe the king's wounded pride. In fact, many contemporaries remarked that Anne was not ugly at all. She simply did not please Henry's taste. So the question lingers, was Anne, wronged by history, condemned forever to wear the title of the reject queen? Today, when we revisit her story, Anne's legacy is not about beauty, nor about rejection. It is about survival in a dynasty where love and marriage were often excuses for death. She outlived. Henry saw the reign of Edward VI and even part of Mary III's rule. She lived while others perished. She smiled while others wept. She found peace in the very failure that was supposed to shame her. Anne of Cleves left no children, founded no new Tudor line, and carved no lasting place in the great religious or political upheavals of her day. But she left something else, a reminder that sometimes survival itself is the greatest victory in history. In a court where death lurked behind every feast, every marriage, every displeasing glance at the King Anne's long and quiet life was a silent declaration of resilience. And that is why when we speak of Henry's 6 wives, Anne shines not for her beauty, not for her romance, but for the strange freedom she gained in rejection. In a dynasty where every woman was defined by the king's gaze, Anne escaped it, and in doing so she became perhaps the freest of them all. Anne of Cleves was never merely the reject queen. She was the embodiment of an alternative path no one had foreseen. And perhaps in her quiet endurance, in her peaceful survival, she triumphed over Henry VIII, not with love, not with power, but by outliving him more serene and more unbroken than any other woman who ever called him husband.